Railroad workers are beginning to get more prepared to strike next month. A recent survey polled many railroad union workers, and the results are in. More than 9 in 10 freight railroad workers believe they should go on strike to secure better wages and better working conditions. And what's most disturbing is a recent message I received from an actual railroad worker that said, "I drove for RailCrew Xpress, and yes, 4 days ago I heard the scary news." And get this, guys. He said, and I quote, "Strike signs are being given out already for BNSF." Now, this is not a good sign, no pun intended. Now, the poll results appear to contradict rail union leaders who have downplayed the possibility of a lockout, which could inflict huge damage on the U.S. economy that is still struggling to overcome supply chain snags. Railroad Workers United, a grassroots organization representing rank and file railroaders, found that 96% of nearly 3,200 rail workers surveyed are prepared to strike once they're legally allowed to on or after September 16th. So that is just 2 weeks away. The vast majority of workers surveyed said they would reject a recent labor agreement proposed by the White House appointed Presidential Emergency Board selected by President Joe Biden. The board, created by President Biden last month in an effort to end a years-long standoff between railroads and unions, recommended a 5-year deal that would cap healthcare premiums, provide cash bonuses, and hike rail workers' wages by 24%. Now, that's less than the 31% bump unions requested, but more than the railroad's proposed 17% increase. If a strike occurred, the trucking industry could see enormous demand due to container and boxcar freight that might have to go to truck. Now, a railroad strike would suffocate the trucking industry, especially in states like California, where AB 5 is positioned to put owner-operators out of business. If negotiations are unsuccessful and the cooling off deadlines expire before an acceptable agreement has been made, engineers and train crews could go on strike and completely shut down U.S. railroads. Chemicals, coal, construction materials, crude oil, paper, lumber, auto parts, and new cars would pretty much just stop moving altogether and all at once. Wheat, corn, soybeans, animal feed, beer, birdseed, canned produce, corn syrup, flour, frozen chicken, sugar, and wine would just sit there exactly where they are and never reach the store shelves. And perishables would cook while baking in the intense summer heat for prolonged periods of time in their metal shipping containers. You know, the same intense heat that has California Governor Gavin Newsom asking California residents to stop using electricity to charge their electric battery-powered cars. The same EVs that Gavin Newsom wants to replace gas-powered cars and trucks that he is planning to outlaw by 2035. Now, all those containers with names on the side like JB Hunt, Schneider, and Swift, yeah, they're pretty much not going to go anywhere. They'll be sitting there on the track. Now, imagine trying to put all that stuff onto trucks. It would make the last 2 years during the pandemic pale in insignificance with the volume of freight shippers would be trying to move, overwhelming all sectors of trucking. Not to mention the freight that is already behind schedule on rails like BNSF, CSX, Norfolk Southern, Union Pacific, the list goes on. This is freight that's already loaded on cars and stuck out in the middle of nowhere. And I doubt Warren Buffett has giant cranes and forklifts just randomly spread around the country with qualified and certified skilled workers waiting to effectively and systematically unload and reroute all that freight onto semi-trucks and tractor trailers. For the economy as a whole, a railroad strike of more than a few days would be like an economic heart attack. And to be honest with you guys, our economy already has a bum ticker. And as it is, there isn't much more stress it can take and continue to survive. To recap, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen voted by mail in mid-July to strike. And the railroad's union strike vote passed by a majority of 99.5%. So needless to say, these folks are pretty much beyond fed up. The Biden administration stepped in to hold off a strike at least until September while a board of arbitrators developed a potential new contract. Officially or not, the president, Congress, and the U.S. Army always have the power to prevent or break any strike, particularly a railroad strike. And they've done it before. And it's a good bet they'll do it again if they believe they have to. They definitely do not want an economic heart attack. Not right now, and not this close to midterm elections. But railroad workers are fed up, and rightfully so. They've been overworked by the railroads, which haven't been able to hire enough people after mass layoffs during the pandemic. with many previous rail workers reluctant to return. But according to some railroad experts, the current trouble has roots that stretch back to the 1990s when a guy named E. Hunter Harrison implemented PSR, or Precision Schedule Railroading, at the Illinois Central Railroad. This was a new and extremely strict discipline system of rail operations. PSR allowed the Illinois Central to cut its workforce and boost its profits over the next 29 years. PSR spread to all the major railroads in North America. Investors were thrilled, but inversely, railroad workers were not. Over time, PSR resulted in longer, more profitable trains and much longer hours for workers who are on call most of the time. According to reports, one conductor had to fight the railroad for time off to be at his own wife's funeral. Now, after years of cutting payrolls and overworking their remaining people, the railroads are struggling to meet shipper demands. Poor rail service is stranding containers at sites around the country, including 29,000 empties clogging the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, California, which are still digging their way out of the monumental backups from earlier this year. Big shippers are complaining about lousy rail service to regulators in Washington, D.C. Meanwhile, contract talks have gone on for 2 years with no agreement. The railroad workers want change, and the railroads don't. And conceivably, it could all end up resulting in a strike. Historically, though, railroad strikes have been blocked or broken by the government and Congress intervention. The most recent rail strike was in April of '93, and it started on a Tuesday, and both houses of Congress had passed a bill outlawing the strike by Wednesday night. President at the time, George H.W. Bush, was awakened at 1:03 a.m. on a Thursday morning to sign it into law, and this put an end to the 2-day strike. But not all railroad strikes ended so quickly and so peacefully. During a strike in 1922, the railroads continued to operate with scab workers after 400,000 railroad workers walked off the job. But at least 10 people died in violence as workers battled company security guards and National Guard troops. And perhaps the worst and most infamous rail strike occurred in 1877. No unions were involved when rail workers in Martinsburg, West Virginia spontaneously walked off the job in July after the B&O Railroad had just cut their pay for the 3rd time in a matter of months. And the country had been in a depression for the last 4 years. That kind of sounds similar to what we're experiencing today. Although railroad workers haven't gotten their pay cut, they've seen record high inflation for a record-setting near continuous 18 months. While trying to manage to keep up with wages that haven't seen an increase for at least 2 years. The 1877 strike in Martinsburg quickly spread to other railroads and even other industries. Can you imagine that happening today? Now, some local law enforcement sympathized with the strikers, and it looked enough like a general uprising to frighten authorities, all the way up to the president, whom ordered federal troops to help companies put down the strikers across much of the eastern United States. Strikers and sympathizers fought the National Guard, the U.S. Army, and private militias hired by the companies. The Pennsylvania Railroad alone claimed strikers destroyed 39 buildings, 104 locomotives, and 1,245 freight and passenger cars, with an estimated death toll of 100 people who died in the violence, most of which shot by troops and company militia. So there's that. Now, I can't imagine that railroad workers in 2022 are so fed up that they would stage an illegal strike, but who knows what to expect nowadays. But at this point, I don't think a strike would be considered illegal after the end of the second cooling off period. A railroad strike, although improbable and highly unlikely, doesn't mean we should ignore the warning signs and possibility. We still need to understand the overall catastrophic effects it would have on our overall supply chain and economy in general. And on top of that, a trucker strike and/or trucker shortage, coupled with the previous threat of diesel fuel supply and possible shortages as a result of fewer U.S. oil refineries. And don't forget the BP refinery plant in Whiting, Indiana, that went down after an electrical fire just a few short days ago. Not to mention the Biden administration sending our fuel reserves to Europe and China. So with that being said, we've all seen so many things in the past 2 years happening that we could not have imagined happening before, so who knows what will actually happen next. And earlier this week on Monday, 3 rail unions representing 15,000 workers reached a tentative deal implementing the recommendations. These survey results raised the question of whether workers will approve the deal, and as of recording this video, none of the 9 other rail unions have yet to announce their own agreements. Now, to me, this has backfire, collapse, and disaster written all over it. 3 out of 12 is not good odds. And these 15,000 workers represent a small portion of the over 140,000 plus workers collectively. The possible fallout from failure to reach a tentative deal from the other 9 rail unions would unleash pain that most of us have never experienced before. So the National Carriers Conference Committee, which represents freight railroads, said in a statement, "In the interest of all rail stakeholders, now is the time for railroads and their unions to reach a contract." So here's the deal. Federal law gives Congress the power to halt or delay any railroad walkout, but Congress has not dealt with the issues in 3 decades. Lawmakers could vote to impose the Presidential Emergency Board's recommendations or appoint arbitrators to fast-track a new contract, among a few other options, if the rail workers decided to strike. Workers have consistently complained that freight railroads are raking in huge profits while failing to raise wages or improve working conditions. And this is all unfolding while freight carriers have struggled to keep pace with huge demand for goods after letting go of tens of thousands of workers in recent years. Add to that, energy and agricultural interests have warned lawmakers that freight disruptions are driving up prices for consumers, while workers say they're being forced to work unwieldy hours without adequate breaks. If we were to experience a shutdown of even just 75% of Class 1 rail and see at least 30% of our supply chain frozen, even with the president, Congress, the Army, and National Guard stepping in, it would not only hurt businesses, it would hurt the workers, it would further hurt the American people. Prices could potentially skyrocket due to hyperinflation and price gouging from the immediate creation of false shortages while folks are desperately trying to stock up, thus increasing demand. Oh, and not to mention the black eye that the Biden administration and his assigned presidential executive board would receive from allowing this to all fall apart after wasting so much time just screwing over the railroad workers. I don't know about you guys, but I would think that allowing something like this to tear this country apart and basically make it impossible for our economy to recover and thus further increasing inflation and hurting the job market even more would be an almost death sentence with voters at the polls. But I guess we're just going to have to wait and see what happens. Only time will tell.